towards the end of the 20th century, all of the reigning kind of pop culture franchises tended to be science fiction. They tended to be Star Wars or Star Trek or The Matrix, The X-Files. Just around the turn of the millennium, that changed. And the first harbinger of it was Harry Potter. But then we became obsessed with The Lord of the Rings, and Twilight, Narnia, True Blood. We, as a culture, started asking questions that science fiction wasn't so good at answering. And these were questions that didn't have to do with maybe technology or the future, or space, or aliens. We needed something else to help us answer, or at least ask those questions. And that something else turned out to be fantasy. We needed to think about magic, for lack of a better world, but also about the natural world and about the past. Those are the preoccupations of fantasy, and right now those seem to be our preoccupations.
You mean like climate change and geopolitical wars?
Yes, I mean, when you look at where modern fantasy began, it began with a lot of people, but principally Tolkien and Lewis, writing in the 20s and 30s. And it's very interesting to see where these guys came from. Tolkien and Lewis, both combat veterans of World War I. They were both fighting at the Somme. And that generation presided over the complete destruction of the world that it knew as children. Those people saw the electrification of cities. They saw the horse replaced by the automobile. They saw the rise of mass media. Saw the rise of psychoanalysis and mechanized warfare. The world that they lived in looked nothing like the world of their childhood. And this kind of trauma that they lived through was what gave birth, I think, to fantasy, which is a literature of longing, a longing for things that are lost, things in the past or wherever you locate them. And I think that we right now are in a similar position. We live in a world that has been radically transformed and does not closely resemble the world we grew up in. And I think that fantasy is a way of, for us, of trying to make sense of that and trying to understand what we lost. They sense something's missing. They didn't lose it. But they live in a very strange world. And you mentioned the iPod. It's a perfect example. The iPod is a very weird piece of technology that we didn't used to have stuff like this. The iPod, I don't know how to put it, it kind of gleams. It is a sealed, gleaming case. We cannot crack it open. You can't. If you did, you couldn't understand what happened inside it. We don't know why it works the way it works. We don't know where it came from, China. But we've never seen that factory. We're not allowed to hack its software. Its form tells us nothing about what it does. It is beautiful, but we are very alienated from it. It represents an artifact that is weird to us, and that in some way we are really disconnected from. Fantasy is a lot, and also steampunk, I think, which is really popular right now, is a way of kind of trying to find a world that we feel more connected to than we feel connected to our iPod. Fantasy is a very interesting phenomenon. It's very interesting to look at the way that we as a culture have turned back to fantasy. And I say turning back because most of the history of human literature is the history of fantasy. If you go back before the 18th century, it's hard to point to anything that would not now be classified as fantasy. A great deal of Shakespeare is given over to ghosts and monsters and fairies and spirits. You go back to Spenser and the Fairy Queen, you go to Dante, you go to Homer, Ovid. There is very little out there before the 18th century, before the rise of the novel and realism, that could not be shelved in the fantasy section, plausibly. What happened in the 18th century was we fell in love with realism. We became infatuated with this idea that literature needs to resemble the world that we live in now. It needs to be about the way that we live now. And novels arose that were very good at describing current events. in this way that was hugely powerful. It was a hugely powerful tool for us understanding what was happening to us. I think we just got a little obsessed with it, this bias towards realism. And now realism is the only thing that's classified as literature. But I would argue that is, we think of that as simply just and right. But in fact, it's an aberration. And I think it's one that is in the process of being corrected. It's hard to talk about postmodernism because nobody, and I put the postmodernists first, is any good at defining what it is. Postmodernism to me looks a lot like modernism, and I'm not sure it's wholly distinct from it. But the one postmodernist slogan that I could grab a hold of, and there are a lot, and they generally contradict each other, has to do with the merging of high and low and the abandoning of this distinction between high culture and low culture, high literature and low literature. That is actually happening. And the way you see it happening is literary writers, and there's a list as long as my arm: Michael Chabon, Jonathan Lethem, Kazuo Ishiguro, people who are understood to be literary writers, but using the tropes of fantasy and science fiction, borrowing them because they need them in order to say what they're trying to say. And slowly, as this kind of cross-pollination happens, and you see it going the other way, you see a lot of fantasy writers using the tools of high literature to tell fantastical stories. The distinction between those two worlds is dissolving, that distinction between high and low. And I think that's a good thing. And if that's postmodernism, I'm all for it.